Hello friends, and welcome back to the Inquisitive channel. I hope you're all well and keeping safe wherever you are around the world. Right then, following on from the last video I posted on animal cell organelles, I wanted to continue with that theme and talk specifically about plant cell organelles. Now, plant cells are very similar to animal cells in the sense that they're both classed as eukaryotic cells. So they both have many of the same organelles. Okay, but plants do have organelles and structures exclusive to the plant kingdom. So I won't go through all of the organelles in plants because plant cells also have a cell membrane to enclose themselves. They also have ribosomes for protein synthesis. They also have mitochondria for energy synthesis, energy production. They also have a cytoplasm where everything is embedded in. They also have a nucleus where all the genetic material is. They have the endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi bodies, cytoskeletons, etc. Okay, so please refer to the other video if you want to know more about these particular organelles. Right then, so before I get into the nitty-gritty of it all, allow me a couple of minutes to give you some context. Okay, I always think context is important. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to say is I fully understand if you're thinking plants, for goodness sake, why plants? Okay, I understand that many people say the same thing to me as well. So when I'm teaching at university, they ask me, "Do we have to learn about plants? Is it really necessary?" Okay, and many colleagues say the same thing. So plants do have this reputation, especially in terms of just learning about cells. Now, if I set out the context of this video, hopefully you won't end up like this, okay? Or end up like this plant here. It looks a bit bored as well. So what I'd like to do, like I said, is give you some context. Okay, so hopefully that'll make the content that I'm about to talk about a bit more interesting. If I haven't persuaded you yet, I'd still like you to sort of hold off from that stop button and just hear me out. Okay, so I'd like you to just sit back for a couple of minutes and let me explain why plants are important and plants are exciting as well, and why plants are necessary for life. Without plants, you and I simply don't exist. Okay, so to help provide some context, I'm going to start off with something random. Okay, the sun. Okay, so I told you it was going to be random. It's not entirely random, but just bear with me. Okay, the sun. What is the sun? It's just a great ball of fire. Okay, well, I mean, you're right. It is a great ball of fire. But as you know, without it, life doesn't exist. Okay, there'd be no warmth, there'd be no light, and I'm afraid there would be no life. Okay. Okay. What about air then? It's just a mixture of invisible gases. And when I talk about air, I'm talking about oxygen. Okay. But without air, as you know, again, there is no life. Similarly, my friends, without plants, there is no life, or at least life as we know it. Now, if you've ever seen the film The Road, which was made back in 2009, I think, I might be wrong, starring Viggo Mortensen, okay, you'll get an idea of what I mean. If you haven't seen the film, I do recommend it. It's really great. It's well directed, it's well acted out, and it really kind of transports you into that frame of mind where it's the apocalypse and how do I survive this. It's a bit terrifying as well. But if you've seen this film, wonderful. If you haven't, like I said, please go and view it. Now, let me give you a bit of a review, okay, just to whet your appetite a little bit. I mean, the purpose of this video is not films, but just bear with me for a minute. Now, in this film, there's been an event, okay, that leads to an apocalypse. Okay, now you never really get to know what this apocalypse is or what happened before the apocalypse. What event happened? You can use your imagination. It might have been an asteroid which impacted the Earth at high speed, and it's just basically ejected a whole amount of material into the atmosphere, and it's blocked out light, and it's caused all the vegetation to die. Okay. Now, Okay, so the trees have died and there's no sign of any plants, and because of this, people in their sort of desperate attempt for survival have resorted to cannibalism. Okay, so yeah, nasty stuff. The film is all about how this Viggo Mortensen character sort of travails this landscape. Okay, looking for scraps here and there, and just sort of being very afraid of the cannibals, so hiding. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention he has a young son as well, so he's trying to protect him as well. Okay, so these cannibals, what they do is they hoard people, lock them up like cattle, and sort of feast on them whenever they feel a bit peckish. Okay, so it's truly terrifying. I couldn't really stop thinking about this film a long time afterwards. Okay. Now I know I've digressed a little bit here, but hopefully you're trying to figure you can figure out whatever I'm going with this. Okay, the film actually speaks to a wider context in terms of this video. Okay, it highlights the importance of plants, in ecology, the environment. Okay, so two massive current affair topics. So hopefully that's food for thought in terms of understanding why plants are so important to learn about. Okay, and knowing more about plants will help you to appreciate what roles they play in the wider context of ecology and the environment. We'll actually talk about the bigger picture of plants in ecology, okay, in a future video. Okay, but today I just wanted to talk about in this video I want to talk about just plant organelles. Okay. Right then. Okay, so we're 7 minutes into the video and we haven't actually talked about plant organelles yet. So let's get down to it then. Okay, so just a little bit about plant cells in general. Okay, remember if you remember last time I talked about animal cells and how big they were. They ranged from around 10 to 30 micrometers. Well, plant cells are a lot bigger than animal cells. They range from 10 micrometers to all the way up to 100 micrometers, so they're quite big. Right, so one of the advantages that plants have over animal cells, and one of the big reasons is why they're so successful in nature, is that they actually can make their own food. Okay, now a lot of you know about photosynthesis. Don't worry if you are not so sure about this process, but we will cover photosynthesis in a future video. But just to touch upon this process right here, right now, photo refers to light. Okay, photons is light particles. So it's using the energy in light, okay, to synthesize glucose. Now, the process looks like this. Okay, so it's where the plants use inorganic carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, okay, to produce glucose. Okay, and what it needs to complete this process is the energy harnessed from light, okay, along with water that's pulled up from the roots. Okay, and so what happens is you get the production of glucose, which is the energy source, which is the food source, which the plants can use and later on, or convert to starch, okay, and store in their roots. And as a byproduct of this reaction, of this photosynthetic reaction, is oxygen. Okay, so this happens mostly in the leaves. Okay, so you see, plants are producing two vital substances here. Okay, they're producing glucose, which can be converted to starch by plants, and then we consume the starchy products for our own nutrition. But more important, well, just as importantly, it produces oxygen. Okay, which is essential for our. It's important for us because we need oxygen for cellular respiration. So it's the process of okay, so cellular respiration is the process by which we can actually break down sugar molecules such as glucose, okay, to produce ATP, which in the mitochondria, which our cells use for energy. Okay, now oxygen is required at the last stage of cellular respiration. Okay. Now, it's quite complicated, so I'm not really going to go into it right now. But without oxygen, you can't complete the last stage of cellular respiration, and you can't produce the large amounts of ATP in the mitochondria. Okay. So without oxygen, we cannot produce ATP. And if the cells can't produce ATP, they don't survive for very long at all. So, just to cut a long story short, okay, plants play two vital roles for our survival. Okay, they produce glucose, which is converted to starch. Okay, but then they produce oxygen as well, which we need for cellular respiration. Okay, so like I said in the beginning, without plants, we don't survive. There is no life. Okay, because it's not just us that need glucose and oxygen; it's also other animals as well. Okay, so because plants can make their own food and therefore they don't need to move around looking for nutrition. Um, okay, so plants don't need to move around looking for nutrition. Therefore, no movement is required. Although they can search for nutrition through their roots, and their roots can grow. Okay, but the plant doesn't physically move from one place to the next. Okay, so because of that, okay, because movement isn't required, plants have actually evolved to become quite rigid. Okay, they're quite strong, very high tensile strength. Okay, and they're rigid because even at the cellular level, okay, plants have this what we call a cell wall, which is hard, which is okay, which is physically hard. It's made up of very hard substance called cellulose. Okay, so as well as a cell wall, I mean, it has a cell membrane just like any other eukaryotic cell. Okay, but outside the cell membrane, it's covered with a cell wall. This is important because I'll discuss this in a minute. Okay, but but without the cell wall, the actual cell will just burst open because the inside pressure is so high. But we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Okay, so which organelles then are specific to plant cells? Okay, we've kind of alluded to a couple of them already. Okay, so chloroplasts. Okay, plants have chloroplasts. Animal cells don't. Plant cells have a vacuole. Okay, and they also have a cell wall. Okay, we have cell membranes, but we don't have a cell wall. Plant cells have a cell wall. Okay, so chloroplasts, a vacuole, and a cell wall. Here's the vacuole. Okay, you can see how big it is. It can cover up to all the way up to 90% even in some plants. Okay, but usually it's about 30% of the total volume of the whole cell. You can see that the plant cells have mitochondria. Okay, but they have chloroplasts. Okay, have chloroplasts, and they have a cell wall. But other than that, every other organelle is the same as any other eukaryotic cell. Okay, so let's talk about these one by one then. First of all, the chloroplast. Okay, so you can see from this image here that a chloroplast is actually not too dissimilar to a mitochondria. It kind of does the same thing. I mean, it's involved with energy production. Okay, but how the chloroplast works, we're not going to go into that in this video. That might be something for another video, specifically on photosynthesis. Okay, now a chloroplast is known as a plastid. Okay, now there are two other plastids you can find in plant cells. One's called a chromoplast and one's called a leucoplast. So leucoplasts, chromoplasts, and chloroplasts are all known as plastids. Okay, so a plastid is any organelle that contains chlorophyll. So if it contains chlorophyll, it can perform photosynthesis. Okay. Now, interestingly, it's not just plants that contain chlorophyll. Okay, there is another kingdom that contains chlorophyll. Okay, and that's called the protista. Okay, so the kingdom of protista. Now, algae, or rather, algae fall in the kingdom of protista. Okay, so a long time ago, a couple of 100 years ago, algae were actually thought to be part of the plant kingdom because they had chlorophyll. But it was in I'm looking at the yeah, that's right, 1866. they were reclassified into a separate kingdom, and this was done by a fellow called Ernst Haeckel. Ernst Haeckel was a German zoologist, and he's the guy who um, looked at Protista, looked at algae, and said, actually, they're not plants at all. Now, there's something extra interesting about this. Well, actually, he's quite notorious. This Ernst Haeckel. He's notorious for his beliefs in. It's not funny, but his beliefs in scientific racism. In other words, he used scientific reason. So he used scientific reasoning to sort of demonstrate that people of the Caucasian race were more superior. Okay, they had better genes, if you like. So yeah, not a pleasant chap. It turns out. But anyway, that's a topic for another day by another person. Okay, so photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast only. Okay, so wherever there's chlorophyll in the chloroplast, this is where photosynthesis takes place. So this is where glucose is actually produced. Okay, so using light energy with carbon dioxide and water to produce glucose. Okay. Okay. Now, how this works? Chloroplast actually contains chlorophylls. Okay, so we mentioned that already. Now, chlorophyll is a pigment. Okay, and this pigment actually captures a specific wavelength of light, especially blue light. Okay, blue light, and it's this blue light rich in energy that the chlorophyll harnesses. Okay, to yield the energy required for photosynthesis. Okay, it's interesting that it captures blue light. It doesn't capture green light. Okay, it reflects green light, and this is why leaves to us look green. It's because it reflects green light. Okay. Another thing about chloroplast, if you ever get to see, if you go onto YouTube, another YouTube video, and look at chloroplast, you might come across a video showing the movement of chloroplasts within the cell. So it's a very dynamic. So they don't sit still. Okay. Actually, no organelle sits still, but chlorophyll or chloroplast rather tend to move quite quickly around the cell. Okay, and they can also, in some cases, independently reproduce as well. So they don't need the actual cell to reproduce. So there is this independent mechanism where they can actually divide by themselves. Okay, so that's enough information for about the chloroplast. Now let's look at the vacuole. Okay. The vacuole, as I mentioned before, occupies usually around 30% of the total cell's volume, but it can go up to 90% in some cases, in some cell types even. Okay. Now, vacuoles are really important because they have several functions. Okay. They're structurally they're enclosed compartments. Okay, filled with sap. Now, what is sap? Okay, it's a watery substance with all kinds of things dissolved in. Okay, normally if it's inorganic, such as minerals or like calcium, potassium, these are all minerals, iron, etc., and organic molecules such as sugar, such as glucose. Okay, so vacuoles can be considered as a storage compartment. Right then. Right. Another very important function of the vacuole is its role in providing turgor pressure. Okay, so turgor pressure. So lots of water, lots of liquid in the vacuole, and that makes it kind of stretch. Okay, because of that stretch, that puts pressure on the cell membrane, actually the cell wall, and that's what gives this, and that's why the cell wall has to be made up of something quite hard, is to prevent the actual cell from lysing, from bursting open. Okay, it's also important. This turgor pressure is also important to prevent wilting. So when you see leaves that are running out of water and you see them wilt, okay, turgor pressure is important to prevent this wilting from happening. Okay, what drives this turgor pressure? Okay, and we're going to talk about osmosis and diffusion in a later video, but I just wanted to mention something here about that. Okay. the fact that inorganic substances such as minerals, such as potassium and sodium and calcium are stored in this, are dissolved in the sap. Okay, when you have things dissolved in water, okay, that creates that gives that environment an osmotic pressure. Okay, so the more minerals you have stored away, or the more minerals you have dissolved rather, in in the sap, in the actual vacuole, the more osmotic pressure there is in the vacuole. Okay, so if you want less turgor pressure, you basically have to remove those minerals out from the vacuole. Okay, but we're going to talk about that in more detail when we talk about diffusion and, well, especially osmosis. Okay, so coming back to turgor pressure is also important for cell elongation. So cells are stretched. Okay, and so turgor pressure is important for that process, and also the process of growth as well. Okay, you need a certain amount of pressure from within to stimulate growth. Okay. Another thing vacuoles are important for is regulating the cell's acidity levels. Okay, the cell's pH. Okay. The actual vacuole, there's an active process by which hydrogen ions are pumped into the vacuole from the surrounding cytoplasm in the cell. Okay, the cytoplasm can't be too acidic, so to remove excessive hydrogens, it's the hydrogens which give rise to the acidity. Okay, so if there's more hydrogen ions floating around in the cytoplasm, the more acidic it becomes, and that can be quite dangerous. So those hydrogen ions are then transported into the vacuole. So the vacuole is important in regulating the cell's pH. Okay, one of the consequences of having turgor pressure, okay, is the fact that if the higher the turgor pressure up to a point, that is, the vacuole actually pushes chloroplasts closer to the cell wall. So this is vacuole pushing everything to one side, and that includes the chloroplast. And because you're pushing the chloroplast closer to the surface of the cell, to the cell membrane, that brings it closer to the actual that brings it closer to the leaf surface. Okay, and this allows to sort of decrease the distance between the incoming light. Okay, so you basically, light doesn't have to travel deeper into the cell because the actual chloroplasts are being pushed to the side. Okay, closer to the surface. And this allows for more efficient photosynthesis. Okay, so if you lose turgor pressure, you get less efficient photosynthesis. Okay, so the last organelle, if you like, is the cell wall. Okay, again, we've sort of mentioned what the cell wall does. So we've mentioned what it does already in the previous slides, but let me just sort of recapitulate that information. So the cell wall provides the cell with the force it needs to resist the pressure, the osmotic pressure coming from within the cell. Okay, so it's to resist not just the osmotic pressure, but also the turgor pressure as well being applied by the vacuole. Okay, so you've got the osmotic pressure as well as the turgor pressure, and if it wasn't for the actual high tensile strength of the cell wall, the cell would just burst open. Okay, so it needs a cell wall to protect itself. Okay, against these pressures, but also against mechanical pressures as well. There is mechanical movement. Okay, and so cell walls are also important in resisting damage to the inside of the cell through by this mechanical forces. Okay, now how does so what's the actual cell wall made up of then? Okay, what gives this high tensile strength? So the substances that we find in the cell wall are these: cellulose, hemicellulose, and pectin. Okay, now, so what these all have in common is that the individual molecules that make up cellulose, hemicellulose, are tightly linked together. Okay, so not only are they tightly linked together, but they're linked to multiple points. Okay, so there are multiple points at which they're linked together, and this really gives the whole structure of cellulose, hemicellulose, and pectin. And by the way, these aren't independent, so cellulose can be linked to hemicellulose and pectin. So this provides kind of a meshwork of fibers that make up the cell wall, and this gives the actual cell wall its very high tensile strength. Okay, so there you have it, folks. Those are the three separate organelles that you find specifically in plants. I hope that was useful. I hope that was informative, and I do hope that it kind of gives food for thought in terms of developing interest and learning a bit more about plants in general. Okay, so that's it for now. I don't want to keep you for too long. As usual, okay, a comment. Please comment on these videos. Post a question, okay, and if you like the video, please hit the like button, okay. And like I always say, subscriptions, obviously they're free for you, but it does provide some analytical tools in terms of getting an idea of how useful these videos are. Okay, that's it. So all the best. Good luck with the rest of your day, and all the best, and stay safe, everyone. Goodbye.